You are listening to Underground History, a collaboration between Jefferson Public Radio and the Southern Oregon University Laboratory of Anthropology, or SULA. I'm your host, Chelsea Rose, and each episode we take a deep dive into little-known aspects of history in the region and beyond. I'm joined today by Megan Kate Nelson, author of a recently published book that I have been waiting with bated breath to read, titled The Westerners: Myth-Making and Belonging on the American Frontier. And you can hear Megan talk about the book at an upcoming prestigious Oregon Historical Society Mark O. Hatfield lecture series on April 14th. Megan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so let's start out with the same framing that you use to open your book, with Turner's famous closing of the West. And I know this is a really big topic, which you cover beautifully, but can you speak briefly about the importance of Turner's thesis and how the F word would come to haunt historians for more than a century?
Sure, of course. I was just on a panel with some other Western historians a couple weeks ago, and we were saying that it's a U.S. Western history book when Frederick Jackson Turner is either in the prologue or the epilogue or both. And I believe he is in both of those elements of the Westerners. So Frederick Jackson Turner was one of these early historians. He trained at Johns Hopkins right when history was becoming a real academic field in the 1890s. And he gave a talk at a very early meeting of the American Historical Association, which was being held in conjunction with the World's Fair in Chicago. So you can imagine how, this is just catnip to historians to have both of these things happening at the same time. And he went in and he made an argument. It was a bit of a manifesto, actually, because he was trying to make his mark in the field. And he argued that instead of finding the origin of American institutions and ideals in European institutions and ideals, that the United States actually grew from this encounter between white settlers and indigenous peoples, and then also nature, along a continuously moving frontier line. And that line moved from east to west pretty steadily. And whenever the white settlers, succeeded in, kind of handling and pushing indigenous peoples even further westward, or just kind of taking care of whatever natural challenges there were, then they would start to build towns, schools, churches, and all of these institutions were the centerpiece of American democracy. And, this was an unusual argument. This was actually quite radical for the time. But Turner was not inventing it out of thin air. All of these ideas about the frontier, about movement from east to west, about white settlers and their victory and their conquest in the West had been kind of in the air in the zeitgeist since the early 19th century. And Turner actually did admit this a little bit later. He said, I was just articulating what I was seeing in the world, and these ideas were kind of out and about. And the paper itself kind of didn't do much at the meeting, but it was then published, and it gained a lot of readers, including Teddy Roosevelt. And Americans just really took it up as this foundational idea in American history and in American culture. And it really dominated the whole course of U.S. history and also Western history for more than 100 years, basically. And is still with us today, despite the valiant efforts of, U.S. Western historians to try and combat it.
Yeah, and I remember the class in grad school vividly where I was introduced to new Western historians and my mind was blown. Shout out to Laura Alice Watt, who was my professor at the time. But now we're in like the new Western history era. Like, is there a new name for where the discipline is now? I'm an archaeologist, so I'm a little bit out of the loop. But
right.
It's interesting to see how far it's come. But obviously, there's still so much more to do.
Oh my gosh, it is like trying to hold back the tide, and this is what was interesting to me and why I wanted to write The Westerners is that, this frontier story is so sticky. It's so compelling that even 40 and 50 years of really amazing research on the part of Western historians coming from all different fields, coming from indigenous history, Latinx history, Asian history, migration history, all of this work is only circulating, I think, in academia. or it is just not compelling enough to the general American public to really stick in their minds. It's this really kind of incredible thing. And so I wanted to investigate that. And when the frontier myth had really started to emerge, and take root, and then how it was that so many people, so many diverse communities that actually built the West just were erased from this myth. And then what were the costs of that also?
Yeah, and it's interesting because Hollywood gets a lot of credit for kind of framing the way we think about Western identity today, but you can really see this myth-making actively happening at the turn of the 20th century. So people are already valorizing the pioneers and, making the native savages out, they're making the indigenous folks seem more violent and, the pioneers seem braver. So why do you think that even then people are like reframing the settler colonial period?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of reasons that the frontier myth was so compelling and continues to be so compelling. One of those reasons is it has a very nice linearity to it. You've got people moving from east to west, one direction on a line. It's a very simple thing. And people like and tend to remember simple stories, right? When things get complicated, when things get messy, it's kind of interesting, but it's harder to actually grasp and understand. And so the simplicity of that narrative, I think, is one of the things that explains its success. And then also, the narrative basically is that these, white pioneers are moving west in their Conestoga wagons, and they are facing these challenges that Turner laid out, and they are succeeding and persevering and settling the West. And that also dovetailed really beautifully with Manifest Destiny, which is an ideology that just is in the ether again, but doesn't get expressed until 1845, but then takes hold of the American imagination. And then also the American dream. This is the idea that you can go and take up land and succeed, and you don't have to come from money. You don't have to have an inheritance. You don't have to come from royalty. You can kind of make your own way. And that also dovetails really nicely with rugged individualism, another ideal that emerges in this period, where the pioneers are depicted as doing everything by themselves, right? Like it's because of their own gumption, it's because of their own character traits that they succeed, and not because, say, the federal government passes the Homestead Act in 1862, which enables them to file claims for land, or that they put a bunch of money into building the Transcontinental Railroad, which makes, basically big agriculture and the cattle industry possible in the late 19th century, right? So I think that all of those things are working together. And then you have someone like Turner coming along and giving it the imprimatur of academic history.
Yeah.
And saying, yes, this is true. and it's very persuasive, and it's so sticky because, you and I both know, Chelsea, that like historians, archaeologists, people in all different fields have been working really hard to explode the frontier myth, and it has not worked in the American imagination.
You're listening to Underground History on the Jefferson Exchange. I'm your host, Chelsea Rose, and today we are trying to explode the frontier myth.
We are. We're going to keep trying.
We're going to
even
do
though
it.
It's super difficult. We're going to keep trying.
So, your book takes us on this westward journey, but through the eyes of the experiences of a new set of characters, and many of whom are familiar, especially for folks living in the West. But now they get this main character energy that they deserve. And so can you speak a little bit about the process of coming up with the vignettes and how you selected the individuals to be our guides through this story? We have Sacagawea, Polly Bemis, and we've spoken about her on the show before, Jim Beckworth. Mm-hmm. So how'd you find these folks to guide us through?
Yeah, this is one of the most enjoyable parts of the research process, is kind of choosing who you're going to be writing about. And, I choose people for a variety of reasons. One is that there needs to be enough material out there that I can actually build a sense of them as individuals, as people who lived in the world. So it's not necessary for them to have produced an autobiography like Jim Beckworth did, although it's amazing when they do. It's sort of like, oh, thank goodness. But, we don't have that kind of thing for Sacagawea, right? But I knew I wanted to start with an Indigenous woman's voice and starting with her seemed like the logical thing to do. It was a little bit intimidating, I'm not going to lie. She's so famous and so mythological that I didn't know kind of how it was going to go. But once I started reading the Lewis and Clark journals, and I figured out that they mentioned her more than 150 times.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And every time they mentioned her, she was always saying something or doing something. And for me, when you write narrative history about individuals, those pieces of evidence are just so important because I want to put readers on the ground with these people. And so knowing what they were saying and knowing what they were doing is huge. And, yes, it's coming from a white authored source, but there were multiple journals that were corroborating the stories that she was telling and the things that she was doing and the experiences that she was having. So I felt, really good about being able to tell her story, even though that source base, and, as you know, for a lot of women in particular, and also women of color, is very difficult to find at really a lot of stages of history, but particularly, in the 19th century American West. So, but I wanted to start with her. I thought she was an amazing person. And also, you always want to have at least one person in the book that readers will have heard of before if you are writing about previously unknown people or people that just, are not in the textbook usually, right? And so I had found Maria Gertrudis Barceló through previous research for my book, Three-Cornered War. And I couldn't talk about her in that book because she died in 1852. So that was pre-Civil War. I couldn't work her in, but I was like, oh, she's so great. I mean, she moves from south to north into the West. And this is one of the major themes of the book is that people are not just moving from east to west. They're moving in all directions through the American West all the time.
Yeah, and Polybemus is coming east.
Yes, exactly. And she's come the furthest, right? I mean, she's trafficked from Hong Kong to Idaho. And so she's traveled thousands of miles before she even enters what we think of as the American West at this point. And so that kind of sense of kinetic energy and the fact that people were circulating around the West and around each other during this time is a really important argument of the book. And I think one of the defining features of the West. And, Barceló moves to Santa Fe. She becomes a gambling tycoon. She makes a ton of money out this card game called Spanish Monte. And she makes so much money that she speculates in currency and in mules and loans money to Anglo businessmen. And when they don't pay her back, she takes them to court, which is how we get some of the records that we have about her, and also how I know what her signature looks like, and that she had a little flourish that she included with it to prevent other people from signing in her stead. I mean, just like these are incredible figures, and especially the women. There are 4 women in the book. Sacagawea, Barceló, Polybemus, who we've already referenced, and then Ella Watson, who is a Canadian woman who migrates north to south and initially works in hotels and private homes as a cook and a housekeeper, divorces her abusive husband, and ultimately ends up in Wyoming trying to make her dreams of becoming a cattle queen come true. But she runs afoul of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. And so, I wanted first of all, I wanted to write about women because I haven't written about them a whole lot. And I was tired of writing about dudes. But I also kind of wanted to talk about women who you don't usually hear about, right? Because usually Western film and TV and often some stories focus, they're focused on sex workers, they're focused on teachers, or just, kind of the mother in the Conestoga wagon. And I was like, women are real people. Yeah, I know. It's a surprise. It's a shock to everyone. Women are real people, and they had desires and dreams of their own. And they lived lives that were often extraordinary and often quite ordinary. And I wanted to show that as part of the Western experience as well.
And I think you did an amazing job, and I have so many more questions for you, but we're running out of time. But luckily for me and listeners, you can pick up a copy of The Westerners, Myth-Making and Belonging on the American Frontier at your favorite local bookstore and learn more about this. Megan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me on. It was great.
That wraps up this round of Underground History on the Jefferson Exchange. I'm your host, Chelsea Rose, show producers Charlie Zimmerman. You can find this episode and many more wherever you get your podcasts.